Hi, I'm Lance Reddick, and I'm here to roll the dice and tell you some stories. Most memorable scene. There was a shootout in the film that I did called The Guest, and I was playing this ex-Special Forces guy. And we're shooting in Arizona in July, and I'm wearing all black with a bulletproof vest and a long leather coat because the producers thought it would look cool. In order to try to keep me from getting heat stroke, they actually put ice packs in the bulletproof vest.
I need you to come with me, please.
And all it really did was make really cold sweat. So yeah, I think that's probably my most memorable scene.
Military police, I'm gonna need your vehicle.
What?
Most fun Hollywood encounter. About 20 years ago, I did this film called The Siege. It starred Denzel Washington and Annette Bening and Bruce Willis. And on my very first day of shooting, the person walking me to set was also walking Annette Bening to set. I was tempted to just be nervous, but it just occurred to me to just start talking to her.
Oh, God.
She was very, very nice to me. Fast forward about a month and a half later, I was in Los Angeles doing some interiors for the film. And I walked on set and I see Annette, and I assume she doesn't remember me. So I walk right past her.
He's waiting.
He's waiting? The hell is he waiting for?
From behind me, I hear this, "Hey, Lance," and I turn around and it's Annette. I was just so taken that she remembered me and that she went out of her way to say hello to me. It's the kind of thing that you don't forget.
Do you have any idea what you're starting here?
Unexpected audition. Not only was this an unexpected audition, it is, I think it's hands down the worst audition I've ever given. So about 6 months after I got out of drama school, I got a call to audition for a play called 7 Guitars. And I got the audition the day before. And usually with theater auditions, you get like a week to 2 weeks. So I get this audition material, and it's basically a page-and-a-half monologue. So I'm nervous as heck. I take the subway, this is in New York City, to the audition, and I get off the subway, and I hear somebody say, "Lance!" And I turn around, and it's Jeffrey Wright, who had just won the Tony Award for Angels in America. And he said, "Hey man, where you going?" I said, "Well, I'm going to this audition." He said, "7 Guitars?" I said, "Yeah, me too, let's go." I'm like, oh man, no.
I say the odds are about even.
We get to the audition space, and I sit down, and in walks Keith David. Keith sits down right next to me. He leans over to me, he says, "So what part you auditioning for?" And I said, well, Kingwell. He goes, and he leans back. The door opens, and Meg Simon, the casting director, steps out, and she says, "Lance, we're ready for you."
Would you help set the mood for our new guest?
So I go into the audition, I sit down, and I try to compose myself, and I look down, and my fly was open. So I basically just sat there with my head buried in the sides, and I read it. The casting director looked at me, she said, "Lance, thank you for coming in on such short notice," and she shushed me out of the room.
And as always, it is a pleasure having you with us again.
Then she didn't call me for a few years. So that was not only the most unexpected audition I've ever had, that was the worst.
I, however, would be willing to accept the responsibility.
So now that you know a little more about me, you can now see me in John Wick Chapter 3, PARABELLUM.
Let us begin.